Welcome, everyone. This is a really exciting event that we're hosting today. Welcome to the Global Research Network. So my name is Yuriko Otomo, and I am helping with colleagues to run the network, which is dedicated to connecting scholars from both the global north and the global south to have these sorts of international conversations. And what we do is offer a really wide range of workshops, training sessions, and social occasions as well. We run virtually so as to enable everyone to participate and connect. And there's also a think tank, including the program on animals and biodiversity, which is hosting this event today. I'd like to perhaps hand over to Jericho to introduce our wonderful speakers, and then perhaps the speakers to talk a bit about this very important convention on animals within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you, Yuriko. Hi, everyone. I'm Jericho Fiestas Flores. I'm a junior fellow at GRN in the Animals and Biodiversity program. I'm a PhD student in agricultural resource economics. And I'm honored to present today the speakers. I would like to introduce first Daina Bray. She's a climate change and animal agriculture senior litigation fellow and project manager at the Law, Ethics and Animal program at Yale Law School, and a senior research scholar in law. Daina has extensive animal law and litigation practice experience and a sustained and pragmatic commitment to making a positive difference in the ways that we interact with non-human animals. She previously serves as a general counsel of the nonprofit Mercy for Animals and International Fund for Animal Welfare, and practiced with major international law firms in the areas of litigation and international arbitration. Daina is a co-chair of the American Bar Association, ABA, International Animal Law Committee, a past chair of the ABA TIPS Animal Law Committee, and a past chair of the Tennessee Bar Association Animal Law Section. Daina received a GD from Stanford Law School, a Bachelor in International Studies from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, as a Moorhead Scholar, a Fulbright Scholarship from Research in Environmental Education, and the 21st ABA Excellence in the Advancements of Animal Law at Work. I would also like to introduce Rajesh K. Reddy. He's a founding member of Lawyers for the Convention on Animal Protection. Reddy directs the Global Animal Law and Animal Law Advanced Degree programs at the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School, where he teaches an international law, animal law, legal philosophy, and emerging topics in animal law, among other topics. Outside of Lewis and Clark, Raj chairs the international subcommittee of the Animal Law section of the American Bar Association and serves as a board member of Mining Animals International. He has previously served on the executive committees for the Animal Law section of the Oregon State Bar, Humane Voters Oregon, and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion nonprofit Encompass. He has advanced human and non-human animal rights as part of his work for several nonprofits, including the Animal Legal Defense Fund, criminal justice programs, and the Human Rights Law Network in New Delhi, India. Thank you both for coming, and we look forward for your presentation.
Let me first say thank you so much, Yuriko, Jericho, Rebecca, Taimat, for that kind introduction, and GRN in particular, for creating this space for us to discuss this timely topic. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you all now. Before we sort of jump into our formal presentation, we'd like to share a very short 3 or so minute clip that introduces you to some of the other members of our Convention on Animal Protection Working Group and speaks to this critical need for states to negotiate an animal protection treaty.
COVID-19 has caused social and economic devastation and claimed more than 5 million lives. This raises 2 fundamental questions for humanity. How did we get here, and how do we stop it from happening again? The Draft Convention on Animal Protection seeks to address these questions and provide a blueprint for minimizing the risk of future pandemics.
Like COVID-19, some 70% of new diseases are zoonotic. This means they originate in host animals and spill over to humans. Such diseases also include HIV-AIDS, Ebola, Nipah, and SARS.
We know how spillovers occur. The science is clear. Mixing wild animals and commercial animals and keeping them in cramped, inhumane, and unsanitary conditions, whether in live markets, during transport, or in intensive confinement, creates the perfect storm. As humans and domesticated animals come into increasingly close contact with wildlife via encroachment on natural habitats through deforestation and deep forest hunting and scavenging for bushmeat, the risk of spillover is magnified. To protect ourselves from pandemics, we must protect animals as well.
Countries can take steps to mitigate the risk of a future pandemic, but no country can do it alone. It requires cooperation to regulate high-risk spillover situations while advancing basic international standards for the protection of animals.
The Draft Convention on Animal Protection seeks to do this by providing a text for countries to consider and negotiate.
The One Health concept, embraced by the UN, the WHO, and the CDC, recognizes that public health, environmental health, and animal health are inextricably linked. You can't have one without the others. Yet international efforts have largely omitted animal health. The failure of society to address animal welfare globally has grave consequences, not only for animals, but for humans and our shared existence.
The COVID-19 pandemic has shown us the enormous cost of this omission. So let's build a healthier world for all and stop the next pandemic. We have the knowledge and we have the power to mitigate zoonotic spillovers now. There is no time to lose. Please support the Convention on Animal Protection. Let's act now.
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 Agissons maintenant.
Let's have a new dude.
让我们现在开始行动吧。
Vamos agir agora.
Let's act now.
For more information, please go to conventiononanimalprotection.org.
And so I'd like to take a step back now and put what we just saw in context of the present moment. For at least here in the United States, we've lost our 1 millionth life to COVID-19, with our death total leading all nation states. And globally, this number has inched past 6 million. So 6 million lives that have been lost around the world to a disease that was in our collective power to prevent, but in our collective power only. And I'd like to get slightly political here, if I may. I'll assume that at least some of you in the audience may be familiar with the Trump administration's rhetoric and the early stages of the pandemic. And so once it was clear that COVID-19 had taken root on our shores in March of 2020, our leaders started referring to the virus as our quote unquote invisible enemy. And to be sure, we weren't the only ones. I've been meditating on this particular construction for some time, and I think there's a sound, if self-serving rationale for it. The general logic being that this invisible enemy is one, this sort of a common foe against whom we could lock our arms and unite, against whom we could cast some of our leaders as wartime presidents or prime ministers who have to essentially be kept in office to keep us through this sort of metaphorical fight. But I think this contrivance of a hidden enemy also suggests, if not outright declares, that we couldn't have seen this crisis coming, and as such that we couldn't have prevented it in the first place. And what our working group would like to do is dismantle this particular narrative in light of the fact that, virologists, epidemiologists, animal advocates, and others have been warning of the increasing threat that zoonoses, or as the video explained, these diseases that can be passed from non-human animals to human animals, have posed to the world for quite some time. And this particular graphic captures just a few of these zoonotic diseases, including HIV-AIDS, which jumped from chimpanzees to humans, Marburg and Ebola, which jumped from bats to monkeys into humans, SARS, which spilled over from horseshoe bats to civets and then into humans, and Nipah virus, which jumped from bats to pigs to those folks in Malaysia who are farming those pigs. And although, Nipah is less contagious than COVID, it's far more deadly, with estimates putting it at between a 50 and 75% mortality rate. And that, I think, should strike fear in us, given that in the midst of the current pandemic, we've had multiple outbreaks of Nipah and other viruses that aren't included here, including African swine fever. And of course, there's COVID-19, which the great weight of evidence shows came from horseshoe bats before almost certainly, or at least very likely, passing through and mutating in an intermediate animal in a Wuhan live animal market before again spilling over into humans. And another sort of narrative that we'd like to dismantle or correct is that this is purely a live or wet market phenomenon. You know, these spillover pathways also come in the form of fur and puppy mills, animal use laboratories, domestic livestock markets, hunting, and more. And these viruses don't just randomly spill over into the human population. You know, rather, it's the case that our governments and, you know, privileged corporations have approved these high-risk exploitation, and these forms of systemic cruelties that have led to spillovers no longer being, you know, questions of if, but when. And collectively, the world has been satisfied with this question of when for about 100 years now, and actually almost 100 years to the day that COVID-19 was declared a global pandemic. And the World Organization for Animal Health, or the OIE, was created in the early 1920s to basically stop or address zoonotic disease spread. And what occasioned its creation was the emergence of rinderpest, which is basically a type of cattle plague, which broke out in Belgium in 1920 when Zebus cows from India were being shipped all the way to Brazil, but passing through the port of Antwerp. And although the OIE does some laudable work in this formal sector in some states, it doesn't actually have enforcement mechanisms, and it doesn't offer guidance to informal breeders or for wet markets. And so we still see these diseases emerge and cross borders. And the result is this sort of testament to the need to create a more robust international framework, a framework with actual binding obligations. And so one of the questions is, well, what would prove the foundation for that new paradigm? And I'm going to assume that at least some of you are already familiar with the One Health concept, which more or less recognizes how our health and our well-being as humans is inextricably tied to that of the environment and of animals. And if you've had a chance to read the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that came out in February of this year, you likely appreciate just how dire the state of our environment and the animals who inhabit it is, with that particular report warning of cascading ecosystem collapses that will see the spread of numerous zoonotic disease outbreaks. And so states have to advance environmental protections on the one hand, and they have to advance animal protections on the other if we're going to have any real shot of safeguarding our own health as humans. And so I suppose the critical question here is, if states know, and they do know, that regulating our high-risk contact with animals and attending to their most basic welfare needs can significantly decrease the likelihood of some of these zoonotic disease outbreaks, well then why don't they just do it? And they could, but they could also unilaterally regulate their use of fossil fuels and other causes of anthropogenic climate change. But states have little, if any, incentive to do that on their own because the effects of climate change and pollution, they aren't fixed to geographical or political boundary lines. And what that means is that even if they did go more or less carbon neutral, they would still be faced with the harms externalized by others. And so the question is, why take the necessary steps internally if you're going to be made to suffer the same fate due to external forces? And so given this shared fate, we've seen leaders speak to our need for collective action, for global talks. And in the climate space, we've negotiated the Paris Agreement, the Kyoto Protocol. And so then why do we need a pandemic treaty? Because just like with pollution, the risk borne by one state with regard to its treatment of animals externalizes all of those harms upon all other states. And so viruses and other pathogens don't, again, just restrict themselves to geographical or political boundary lines. As commentators here in the US have observed with respect to our own government's decision to close its borders in the early stages of the pandemic, the fact that we live in this increasingly interconnected and globalized world, it's like locking the door after the killer's already slipped inside. And so every state has witnessed these effects, from mass border closures to the shuttering of entire industries and businesses. And so personally, when I'm asked, why a pandemic treaty, my background is in literature. And so I turn to sort of the root of the word itself, from the Greek pandemos, which translates quite literally to all people, this notion that we have this sort of shared story, this shared fate. And the World Health Organization underscored this predicament of our shared fate and this clarion call that it issued to all nations in March of last year, in fact. And this open letter, which you can find on their website, pointed to the pandemic as the biggest challenge that the world has faced since it was torn apart by World War II, when leaders realized that they couldn't embrace more or less this lure of isolationism if they were going to secure prosperity for future generations. This prosperity that could be actualized only through mutual accountability, transparency, and cooperation, which in and of itself could only be provided for by an international agreement, as it would be more or less a fatal mistake for all of us to treat COVID-19 as a singular occurrence. And indeed, the question was no longer if this would happen, but when it would happen. And as if underscoring sort of the etymological root of that word pandemic, all people, this particular letter offered this haunting reminder that no one is safe, none of us are safe until everyone is safe. So again, pandemics are sort of a collective story, and one that we as states or citizens of states can't write ourselves out of.
Thank you, Raj. Should I jump in here?
Yeah, please.
Yes, great. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much to Yuriko and to Heriko and to Rebecca and everyone at GRN. And thank you to our audience here and on YouTube. It's really great to have an opportunity to discuss these issues with you, which are so critical. So it's wonderful to see the interest. As Raj mentioned, there are collective efforts ongoing to address the crisis of the pandemic, and that's very encouraging. The World Health Organization, as Raj mentioned, has called for the negotiation of an international treaty for pandemic preparedness and response. The intergovernmental negotiating body of the World Health Organization held their first meeting last month, and they'll make a recommendation by 2024 on a pandemic treaty coming out of the World Health Organization, which is really encouraging. These efforts out of the World Health Organization focus on a pandemic response and pandemic preparedness, and both of those things are looked at with a view toward human health. We are pleased, though, that the World Health Organization and other leaders have also recognized One Health, which is the approach that Raj already mentioned, which recognizes that human health, environmental health, and animal health are all inextricably connected. So the WHO has said that its treaty will also include a recognition of the One Health approach and our connection to animals. We're also seeing, I think you can click through there, Raj, yeah. We're also seeing an increasing focus in the WHO treaty process on pandemic prevention. It seemed that things started at response and preparedness, and that there's now more of a focus on prevention, which we're really heartened to see. And of course, when we start looking at prevention, that's when we really look closely at our interactions with animals, and that's where prevention comes up. Next slide, please. There are also two other international proposals that are currently under consideration that would focus on pandemic prevention and on our interactions with animals. First, the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime has proposed adding a new protocol, a wildlife crime protocol, to the UN Treaty Against Transnational Organized Crime. And the idea there would be because wildlife trafficking is itself a key risk underlying zoonotic disease spread, to use this protocol to enhance cooperative enforcement, to combat wildlife crime and to reduce the risk of disease transmission. So that's a very interesting development. There's a second proposal that has been made relating to the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species, or CITES. The idea, CITES currently applies to trade in endangered species, and the proposal is that CITES should expand its scope to also include regulation of trade in high-risk wildlife. So all of these things, the WHO treaty, the additional protocol under the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, the proposal for an additional scope for CITES, are all very interesting, and we're very heartened to see it. They do, though, each have limitations. So we know that UNTAC is limited to illegal wildlife trafficking. CITES is limited to the international trade in wildlife. WHO, of course, by its very mandate, is focused on human health. And because of those limitations and those proposals, we believe that more needs to be done, including to recognize that our interactions with animals, both wild animals and also, very importantly, animals under our care, must be reviewed for their potential to cause the emergence of new pathogens. Next slide. In addition to overlooking all of the modes of potential disease emergence, the current international law framework, it almost entirely fails to look at individual animal well-being. So these are some examples of the scant references to animal welfare that we see in existing international agreements. CITES has this very limited protection that living specimens must be shipped as to minimize the risk of injury, damage to health, or cruel treatment. That's a very minimal protection. There's also an agreement on international humane trapping standards between the EU, Canada, and Russia, which requires parties to cooperate on the development of more humane trapping methods. But again, the main purpose of that treaty is to facilitate trade amongst those countries. There are also various European Commission and European Union agreements that reference animal welfare. And increasingly, we're seeing protections for animal welfare being built into bilateral and multilateral trade agreements, which is a really interesting development. And it's becoming possible because the World Trade Organization has recognized that animal welfare is an important ethical concern that can, in certain situations, override the WTO's protection of free trade. So again, all of these developments are positive, but they are not comprehensive. They don't govern our interactions with all animals and all of our interactions, and they don't provide a platform that would allow us to address the many current crises that we face. It's clear that if we want to respond to these crises, whether we're thinking about climate change or pandemics or biodiversity collapse, we must comprehensively reset our relationship with animals to respond to all of those things that we face. Encouragingly, there are multiple more comprehensive efforts underway. The next slide is about the UN Environment Assembly Nexus resolution. This is a really exciting recent development that just happened last month. This was following great work by the African Network for Animal Welfare and the World Federation for Animals. The UN Environment Assembly adopted this resolution recognizing the link between animal welfare, the environment, and sustainable development. And this resolution was the first time that a major UN body explicitly referenced animal welfare in a resolution. So it's very exciting. And this report that is being worked on is due at the UN Environment Assembly meeting in early 2024. So we're very interested in and watching that space. Next slide, please. This idea of a comprehensive international agreement to protect animals is not a new idea. There have been several similar initiatives in the past. As you see here, a couple of them are non-binding declarations, and a couple of them have been proposals for binding conventions, like the Convention on Animal Protection. As early as 1978, the Universal Declaration for Animal Rights was proposed at the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. Professor David Favor, who is a member of our working group on the Convention on Animal Protection, first proposed an international convention on the protection of animals back in 1988. So this has, he has been committed to this idea for a long time. We also saw that we've seen the Universal Declaration on Animal Welfare, which was first conceived of in 2000 and has been extensively reworked over the years. By 2014, which was the last significant draft, the Universal Declaration on Animal Welfare had the support in principle of almost 50 countries and important international organizations like the World Organization for Animal Health and the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. More recently, in 2019, the Global Animal Law Association developed a draft treaty called the United Nations Convention on Animal Health and Protection. That treaty was sought to be advanced through the UN system, and as yet, neither of these treaties have been adopted. And our proposal, the Convention on Animal Protection, next slide, please, builds on, we see it as building on these prior efforts and seeking to address these critical gaps in international law. In our vision for the treaty, the Convention on Animal Protection centers animal well-being while at the same time recognizing the negative impacts of our mistreatment of animals, both on public health and on the environment. And you can get a sense of our approach from these fundamental principles of the Convention on Animal Protection. You see that these are a mix of ethical reasons to protect animals based on their sentience and their intrinsic value, along with drawing the connections to public health and environmental protection that are so critical for our survival. So in summary, there are two prongs to our approach in the Convention on Animal Protection. The first is that animals should be protected for their own sake, and that is because of what we know about their sentience, their awareness, their agency, and their ability to suffer. The second prong is that humans must reset our relationship with animals, if only to protect ourselves. Next slide, please. Our current thinking in the convention, which has changed since the first draft of the treaty, we're currently working on a second draft, is that there should be only two categories of animals addressed in the primary convention. One is animals under human care and one is wildlife. We think those categories are necessary because our obligations to animals in these situations are different, and they entail a different balance of affirmative duties, duties to do things for these animals, and negative duties, duties to not do harmful things to these animals. We've moved away from the further categorizations, the further categories that we had in the first draft of our treaty. We had previously had categories based on human use of animals, but what we're trying to do in the revised text that we're working on is emphasize that basic protection should apply to all animals. And again, that is for their own sake as well as for our sake. Last substantive point in the next slide, I just wanted to give you a sense of our general approach to the CAP and what we're thinking. We're thinking that the Convention on Animal Protection will be a framework convention that will include basic protections, and it will acknowledge our interconnectedness with animals and their inherent worth. We also then think that the Convention on Animal Protection could create a space for states to come together and discuss other issues related to animals of concern, and then agree specific protocols on those issues. And you could imagine that these protocols, you could imagine a protocol that is agreed by a group of progressive states who have already done significant reforms in an area and desire to come together to create greater momentum and attract other states to join their commitments. You could also imagine a protocol that includes a more basic commitment that might be more palatable to a larger group of states. And the idea is that a Convention on Animal Protection could create a space for countries to come together and focus on these issues. And also the idea of the framework is that it could allow for a natural process of evolution of obligations under the convention and its protocols to reflect both shifts in public opinion, which then drive nation states' willingness to make policy change. So we hope that's been helpful as an overview of our efforts, and we really look forward to hearing your questions and discussing this further. We would love to be in touch with you. We would love for you to learn more. This is our website, the conventiononanimalprotection.org. You also see here an email address that you can use to contact us, contact@conventiononanimalprotection.org. We have active social media on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. We would love for you to follow us and share. It's really important and helps us get the word out. So please do that right now while you're thinking of it. I'll drop the social media links in the chat here. We have lots of ways to get involved. There is lots of work to be done, lots of different needs. As I mentioned, we're currently working on a second draft of the treaty. We will be putting that out for public comments. We're particularly interested in connecting with folks who have expertise in relevant areas like public health, animal behavior, conservation, environmental protection, folks who have good contacts in relevant government agencies around the world. We'd love to connect with you. Folks who are interested in getting involved in the regional and national groups to promote the convention that we're setting up around the world. We would love to hear from all of you on that, and we look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Daina. It's such important work. And so this is a fantastic opportunity for us to be able to field some questions from the audience, I think. Rebecca, would I be able to hand over to you?
Yes, absolutely.
To pass on some of the questions that we've been getting from our audiences on Zoom and YouTube.
Great. Thank you both. That was wonderful to listen to. I'm so excited about what it is you're doing. So the first question, I'll just jump right into it, is from Veronica. She says, how can we link rights of individual animals with fights against trafficking? Would it be possible to find a transition between, I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure what she's saying. I think it's human environment to reinsertion in nature.
Thank you. I'll jump in on that if that's all right, Raj, and if you have anything to add. I think that's a great question, and I think it's something that has been overlooked for some time in efforts to combat wildlife trafficking. You know, certainly policy reforms and enforcement are very important to prevent the growth and expansion and continued operation of wildlife traffickers. But there's also this really pressing and difficult and sad problem of what to do with the animals who are actually recovered from traffickers. And I think it's encouraging. We've seen a greater focus, I think, from advocates around the world and wildlife agencies around the world in partnering with sanctuaries and other groups who can take in the individual victims of wildlife trafficking. And it's, of course, complicated. Some of these animals can be successfully reintroduced into the wild, which is, of course, the primary goal. And some of them can and would require care for the rest of their lives. So I think that's an area that is increasingly a focus. It's very compelling. And I think it's the kind of thing that could be built into a protocol to the convention.
Yeah, and I was gonna just echo those comments, Daina. I really appreciate this question. And you know, right now, the only sort of international framework to conceive of these type of quote unquote protections for animals protect them insofar as those species are endangered. And so there is nothing particular to animals just as individuals without any sort of attention being paid to the scarcity of those species for continued use. So it's not really focused on sort of the animal's interests and the animal's welfare. It's focused on basically the species and the number of them remaining. And again, to echo Daina's comment, the Convention on Animal Protection is sort of this umbrella convention which could conceive of such advancements in a protocol. And so you could see it working alongside and not necessarily interfering with what CITES does, but complementing what CITES does. And that's really one of the powers of the CAP.
Okay, thank you both. That actually ties in really well with Jill's question that just popped up. Highlighting the connection between animals and viruses, how are you managing potential backlash against animals?
Daina, do you want to go first, or?
That's a great question. I guess I would start by saying that has been a real focus for us in our discussions. And I think it's a good example of the kind of unintended consequences that can come from any policy proposal, and certainly from a sweeping policy proposal like ours. We think that there are opportunities to build in preferred methods of interacting with animals and to prioritize protection, including because approaches that allow us to safely coexist with animals without having to target them and exterminate them are actually, more likely to be successful in addressing the long-term problem. So that is something that we very much have in our minds, and it's something that the details would be worked out in the negotiation and the development of a protocol on wildlife interactions with wildlife. But it's a really difficult concern that we have talked about a lot. Raj, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure, and I'll say that the protocols that we've conceived of, not all of them, but a number of them focus more on the question of, do we need to be engaging in this type of animal use that creates this human-animal interface? And so for the most part, we would love for the CAP to evolve to a place where almost all the protocols are really questioning, do we need to engage in things like fur farming? And with so many industries or brands shifting away from the use of animals for fur products and the like, and the creation now of synthetic leathers that are just as good, if not more durable than sort of natural leather, really calling again into question, do we really need animals for cosmetic testing and the like? And so drawing attention to those human-animal interfaces where we could actually eliminate the potential for zoonotic disease spillover. But to your larger question about, is there a concern about a backlash against animals? One of the things that we've, critically discussed is if we're focusing on things like consumption of wildlife, is the answer necessarily all states then turning to factory farming, which is arguably worse for animals and their welfare? And so it is one of the things that we're attentive to and are trying to frame the treaty in such a way that we can avoid it. But ultimately, the CAP will be negotiated among states, and so there's no guarantee that certain animals won't receive quote unquote backlash. But that's what we're designing the CAP to anticipate and prevent as much as possible.
Thanks. So Yuriko just added in the chat, we can see the CAP requires states institute what some advocates might consider to be bare minimum welfare considerations. How are you bringing together parties with differing interests as to those welfare standards? So kind of tying into what you just said, how are you going to manage the fact that different states will have different ideas of what those welfare standards need to look like?
Yeah, that's a great question too. And we're talking about an international treaty, one that's going to be presented to all states. So it's on the global stage, and so with hundreds of prospective participating entities, all of whom feature a unique economic and food security landscape and have culturally informed relationships with and understanding of those animals in those jurisdictions. And so the standards that we're envisioning for the framework treaty are necessarily going to be minimum standards. And for those states that have proven to be leaders in animal protection efforts, these standards will likely prove to be below what they already have in place in their domestic legislation. But in order to have this sort of global dialogue, you have to have a global platform upon which to discuss these things. And the CAP is that platform. But again, it doesn't work in isolation. It contemplates these protocols upon which states who are invested deeply in animal welfare issues can negotiate further protections for particular animal uses or particular categories of animals. And the CAP also encourages states to equip other states, industrializing states or developing states, to advance their protections through financial and other support and technical support. And the CAP also contemplates states creating, as Daina was mentioning, use of World Trade Organization exceptions to trade barriers. So states not allowing for lower animal welfare products to be imported and sold in their jurisdictions as a way to encourage other states to raise their welfare standards. And again, the CAP can be the place where that dialogue takes place.
I have nothing to add. That was a great answer. Thanks, Raj.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that kind of addressed our next question too about implementing this in countries with little or no animal welfare legislation. So unless you have anything to add to that, I'll move to the next one. Good. Okay.
I guess I'll just on that follow-up question about countries with no current or little animal welfare legislation. I guess I would just add that I think that is one of the areas that's most exciting to think about application of the Convention on Animal Protection. You know, as the previous question gets at, you know, and we've been asked this and we ourselves have wondered, is it worth and trying to start momentum for a treaty that would have fairly basic protections in the main treaty? Is that worthwhile? And, you know, one part of the answer there is what we talked about later, is the importance of creating a space in which countries can come together and these ideas can evolve over time. But the other part of the answer is that the CAP could then, you know, that could be a very sort of transformative experience for states that don't already have existing legislation. And, you know, when we think about those countries, we're looking in our work on the CAP and in the second draft we're working on now, we're giving a lot of consideration to what kind of mechanisms could there be for a transfer of funding and expertise from countries that have more resources already invested in these things and more resources available to those countries who are starting from a different place. And we're also acknowledging the importance of encouraging the states to take an approach in every country, and particularly in countries that would be new to this area, that centers local considerations. Like, we are talking about global issues, but in all of this work, local considerations and priorities have to be centralized. And the way that you can, you know, help that happen is by building in processes for consultation with stakeholders. So that could be social scientists familiar with the area, conservationists, animal advocates, local communities, and local policymakers. We think bringing folks in to help test and vet and make these proposals locally relevant is really important.
Thank you. That's great. Raj, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, that was wonderful.
So you kind of answered how you see it engaging with other environmental protection frameworks, but are there any examples that have maybe come up where you see that integration working?
Yeah, and I think this, you know, it speaks to this critical need that we have to protect the environment in light of, you know, this existential threat that we're facing posed to us by, you know, anthropogenic, our own sort of climate change activity. And insofar as we recognize that we need, you know, carbon sinks, which are our plants, our oceans, our soil, our forests, we can't ensure their health without providing for, you know, the health of the animal species who prop up those ecosystems, who provide quite literally, you know, vital ecosystem services for the planet. And I think right now we're in the midst of the Convention on Biological Diversity's new sort of biodiversity targets. And the conversation right now, in my recollection, is about how much of the natural world we have to set aside and preserve in order to stave off some of the worst effects, again, of, you know, the climate harms that we're visiting upon our environment. And animal life and health and welfare are all critical components of that conversation, even if we're not talking about them at a species or individual level. Without protecting animals, we can't protect our ecosystems, and we can't meet these goals. But again, you know, animals have to be, and their health and welfare have to be part of that conversation.
That's great. Thank you. So I have a question from the YouTube audience from Jackson C. What is the projected timeline for the submission of this convention, and which UN agency would have the mandate to address it?
That is a great question. We have already found that everything takes longer than we expect in the very early stages that we're in here, which of course is disappointing because of the urgency of the issues that we face. You know, in terms of our process, we are deep into the drafting of the second draft of the convention. We hope to release that publicly in the next month or two, at which point we look forward to another round of public comment, because the first round of comments was so helpful to us and really has resulted in a fairly significant rewrite of the treaty. It was incredibly helpful. At that point, we will be continuing our outreach to states, and I think it's all a question of political will to act, as with so much activism. We'll also, at the same time we're reaching out to states and exploring the UN system, we will also be, as I mentioned, working to set up regional and national groups that believe in the treaty, and we're hoping that we can build a network of support around the world. But I think the timeline is very uncertain. And I think, one of my slides showed this sort of long history of proposals, international proposals to protect animals. And this is a long road that we're on. And I certainly hope that we're close to the end of it, but I don't feel qualified to make a prediction on that. Raj, anything you want to add?
No, I think that's absolutely right. But, in our engagement with other working groups, we are really heartened to find that so many are finding this moment to be the moment in which we need to act. And so, there's that saying that there's time enough but none to spare, and this is that moment where there's time enough but none to spare. And again, just really heartening to see how many organizations are, echoing this call, this need to address this issue, and are championing, the prospect of a treaty. And so we're heartened, but cautiously so.
Yeah, and I would just add, I keep thinking my work at Yale Law School focuses on climate change and animal agriculture. So I work a lot on climate change, and I keep thinking, when I think about the climate emergency and the pandemic, the question is, what does it take to focus the human mind? And what does it take to focus our minds at the level of policymakers and major corporations? And, we all have to do what we can and remain optimistic, but sometimes it's uncertain. If we haven't learned by now, I don't know what it will take.
That actually segues nicely into Jane's question from the YouTube live stream. Interesting that animal protection at the front end of the name puts people. In our UK challenge, we put the human protection aspect first to get traction on the topic. Was there a reason?
I think that's a great question. And, all of these efforts, how you describe yourself is so important. I think for us, we have continued to center animal protection. When we got our start through a process in the American Bar Association, we successfully got the American Bar Association to call for the passage of a convention on animal protection. The way we phrased it there was a convention on animal protection to protect public health, the environment, and animal well-being. So we certainly added people on there. We think it's important to think of this as a convention on animal protection because the real thrust here, like I said, is that we must protect animals to confront these multiple crises. And there's this growing ethical and moral understanding around the world that we must protect animals for their own sake and because of what we understand about them and what we increasingly understand about how similar they are to us. So, throughout, we are trying to make the connections, which are there. It's not like we're creating them to human well-being and public health, but we do center animals in our efforts, and that's a great question.
And I'll just add, the foundation for a lot of our efforts come from what is being discussed on the global stage, and you'll hear time and again world leaders talking about One Health, One Health, One Health, and One Health is really, again, about the health of the environment of humans and animals, and they're inextricably intertwined. And so the full treaty of CAP, Conventional Animal Protection for Public Health, Animal Welfare, and the Environment really speaks to that. And I think there's part of our goal, our mission is to get the public to see those things as as singular and not things that you can sort of take apart and, oh, we can address the human health aspect of it and not the animal well-being aspect of it. Because if we do that, we're really just welcoming another COVID-19 pandemic in just a number of years, or Nipah outbreak in a number of years. And so again, I think the core messaging has to be that we can't separate these things. They are inextricably intertwined. And, you know, there are platforms that address public health and that address the environment. And there really isn't anything globally that centers on animal protection.
So Madison asks, there's always been an imbalance in biodiversity seen across the world, with many developing countries being home to more species. So how might this treaty impact their ability to further develop?
I'm happy, Daina.
No, go ahead. I'll add on. Go ahead.
Sure, and this is a really important question, and it's one that we in our working group have wrestled with. And we can talk about intent, but the question is, what is the impact on these communities? And what we envision the CAP doing is having industrialized states, contribute to a monetary fund to ensure that the development of countries where you might not have sort of the same sort of standard of living, but that same standard of living is owed to them, to equip those states to engage in other forms of development or use animals in a way that treats the animals better than maybe, say, in a factory farm type condition. So the CAP is concerned about that, and would, as currently constructed, or at least will be constructed in the second draft, require states who are industrialized to contribute to and basically ensure that developing states aren't unfairly treated.
Yeah, I think that's all right, and this is an issue that we have discussed a lot, and I think it goes to this larger issue of ensuring that the CAP is not, another instrument or vehicle for placing greater burdens on parts of the world that may already be, have access to less resources, and to communities that may be more marginalized. And this is something that we're thinking about a lot. It's going to be a big change from the first draft to the second draft of the CAP that we're working on, by overly focusing on the risk of disease spread from wildlife. In the first draft of the CAP, we think we've missed an opportunity to make clear that just because that's where COVID came from, it does not mean that it is the most risk-producing part of our interactions with animals, and it does not mean that the way we respond to this global crisis should place the burden on communities that are living in close proximity to wildlife. We have to look at all of the ways that we interact with animals, including industrial animal agriculture, and make sure that the CAP is not placing unequal burdens in a way that is not equitable. So that's something that we're talking about a lot in the second draft.
Great, thank you. That was actually a question I had too, so I'm really glad to see that that's a consideration. Jane asked, nope, I'm wrong. Sorry, Brianna asked, will the treaty address how to humanely kill or treat animals who are infected with the diseases that are concerning? She's speaking specifically about the current spread of avian flu across the US and Europe.
I'll jump in on that. I'm also very concerned about the current spread of avian flu across the world and the way that animals are killed. Particularly, I'm most familiar with how it happens here in the United States. And, I will say, I guess maybe I'll just take the opportunity to talk a little bit about industrial animal agriculture and the attendant risks of disease. I am not a scientist. I am sure there are scientists in the community, and I hope you will forgive me for this, but I am a layperson on these issues and I read a lot about them. And there are many scientists who think that the next pandemic will come from industrial animal agriculture, not from a wildlife interaction. And that's for a number of reasons. That's because of the way animals are kept in intensive confinement. That's because of the lack of genetic diversity in the breeds that are raised. It's because animals in agriculture are transported over long distances, and also because of the routine use of antibiotics in industrial animal agriculture. And all of those things combined create a real risk for the development of novel pathogens and their transmission to either wildlife or to humans. And a great example of this, which Brianna has asked about, not a great example, a stark example, is the current outbreak of highly pathogenic avian influenza around the world, which is now occurring in wild bird species as well as in commercial poultry flocks. It's a really scary thing because there have been cases of highly pathogenic avian influenza moving from birds to people. And those infections, when they happen, are often fatal. It has quite a high mortality rate, and it's very scary. What has not happened is efficient or sustained human-to-human transmission, which is what would be required to have a broader spread amongst people. But the more we interact with animals in these dangerous ways, the more likely it is that eventually something like that will happen. And it, of course, has happened in the history of the world, as Raj illustrated in his remarks. So I think we really have to protect ourselves, think about those issues as well. In terms of how the animals are killed, I mean, it's disgusting what goes on in this country in particular with the mass that's referred to by industry as depopulation, or sometimes inaccurately referred to as euthanasia. But these methods are not humane methods of killing. In the US, we see birds being smothered by foam being spread over them. We see pigs being killed through this process called ventilation shutdown, where ventilation is closed to the building and steam is pumped in and the pigs are essentially cooked alive. So those are practices that I personally do not think are acceptable. Would those be addressed in the treaty? No, the treaty itself, the Framework Convention, is not going to go into that level of detail on particular issues. As I mentioned, though, the idea is that this is a framework structure where you could imagine in future that you could see states getting together to talk about, how are we going to commit to actually humanely euthanizing animals in these situations rather than these cruel techniques that are currently used in this country?
And I think I was just looking through the chat, and I think this ties in really nicely with Jess Hooper's question about animal species being unfairly targeted and killed inhumanely. And so will the CAP protect these particular animals, or just animals in general, from politically incentivized vilification? And so to echo Daina's comments, the CAP, in terms of the umbrella treaty, prohibits unnecessary and cruel suffering, unnecessary killing, and cruelty. And states will define that as they do right now at the national level. And in these particular instances where politicians and legislators and administrators are driven by fear, it's likely that they would argue that this is necessary, and that pragmatically the only way that you can kill these animals is perhaps in an inhumane way. And so the umbrella treaty wouldn't necessarily prevent states from engaging in this type of behavior, but a protocol could. But the hope with CAP on the front end is that we don't get to these situations, or that these situations are significantly minimized, so that we don't have these type of outbreaks, because we're not engaging with animals in these particular uses, or putting animals in close proximity, these animals who would normally not be in close proximity with one another. So.
Thank you. That's great. So Jackson has asked if the one welfare approach has been considered in the language of the convention. I will put a link to it in the chat, but if either of you want to address that, that'd be great.
Raj, I'm happy you want to go.
No, but yeah, go ahead.
Raj and I are too polite and friendly with each other. Yes, we think the one welfare approach is really interesting, and it is something that we are studying as we're working on the convention. And in particular, we're learning a lot as we go here, but we've learned a lot about the One Health approach, which is promising in so many ways and also is limited in other ways. And the One Welfare approach is an effort. Thank you for, it looks like putting a link to the chat so folks can learn more about it. To, instead of just a more limited focus on animal health, to look more generally at animal welfare. And that is something that we're very interested in. And we have been incorporating in the convention this concept of animal well-being, which we think provides additional space for these concepts to develop. Raj, what would you add?
The only thing that I would add is what Daina had mentioned. The report that accompanied or that provided the foundation for the ABA resolution talks specifically about One Welfare and how One Welfare would and should sort of inform our approach. So if you want to look for that too, you can just search for it. It's American Bar Association from 2021 Resolution 101C, and maybe Daina's going to put the link to that in the chat. But that also is its principles are woven into the CAP.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Jackson also asked what the reporting mechanism and funding mechanisms are to help promote this convention, and if it would be possible to align a potential development goalpost in 2030.
Raj, would you mind starting on that one?
Sure. By reporting mechanism, I'm not sure if this is with respect to the states reporting to sort of the other entities, other states at a convention, but I'll speak to the funding mechanism. Just like with the Convention on Biological Diversity, developed states are required to contribute to a monetary fund from which developing states can draw upon in order to effectuate their obligations under the treaty. And so the CAP would work in a very similar way.
Great, thank you. Yuriko asked, given this will be the first animal-centric international convention, it'll set standards and an ideological discursive framework to which any future multilateral conventions will necessarily be tied. This is perhaps a more abstract concern, but to what extent are you concerned about the potential that the CAP will restrict radical change on improving animal lives?
That is a great question. It's one that sort of caused us a lot of heartache along the way. I think we are concerned about that, and it's something that I confront in my own activism for animals. That's sort of all fronts. I think we all have different ideas of which policies we would implement if we had absolute control over policy, of course. I always imagine if I had a magic wand, I would do many things. But of course, we are a collective and we are a world. And, I think for me, it comes down to, do you sort of, where you see a path, and we see an opening here based on the prior efforts, based on the current efforts by other groups like the World Federation for Animals, based on the collective focus on the pandemic and the climate emergency, we see an opportunity to do something. And it will not be perfect. And as Raj mentioned, even what we try to do, once it is in the hands of states, eventually, hopefully, they will take it in a direction, that will be different. So I think there certainly are risks. And I think because the way we treat use animals and mistreat animals is so entrenched in all of our interactions around the planet. I think there is potential that we, through the cap, set some kind of an unhelpful baseline. I nonetheless personally feel that is worth making these efforts, which may be imperfect because the current situation is unacceptable and untenable for animals and for us, and we need to do something. And we never know, you never know exactly what will come out of efforts like this. So I think it's a very serious, important question, and we have quite heated discussions about it within our group. We nonetheless think the cap could create a space for change, progressive discussions that would be helpful.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I mean, I think we need to take a long view, and one of the first sort of large international conventions with respect to animals was the International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling, which was basically to solidify and ensure that we could keep exploiting whales. But you look at that treaty today, it hasn't changed whatsoever, but we now have a global moratorium on whaling that's only 3 or 4 states, have created reservations for, and Japan has withdrawn itself from the treaty. But that treaty's evolution in just 30 years has been monumental. And when we think about, CITES, people criticize CITES, and I think rightly so, but even in the framework of CITES, it focuses on the international trade of endangered species. And so I think people look to that treaty and want it to sort of expand beyond sort of the framework that was given to it. And it's just not necessarily able to do that. But if we think about what the cap would do right now, and I agree with Daina and sort of the thrust of this question that yes, the baseline would be very low, but if we're thinking about what the cap could be in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years, we're already seeing a number of states, Mexico just last year was the 44th, to say we don't need to, or we're going to ban the sale of products that were tested on animals, cosmetic products that were tested on animals. And so, again, I think that the cap can be this global platform where all of these developments can build upon one another and really advance animal protections globally in a way that has just never been done before.
That's great, thank you. From Jericho, how will the cap navigate varying conceptions of nature and animals across the world, being respectful of traditions and avoiding Western-centric perspective in text or in practice?
That's a very important question, and I think we sort of touched on some of that before. We are doing further work on the provisions in the cap around Indigenous communities and looking at examples from other international agreements. I mentioned before that we want to build in opportunities for consultation as a way of centering the local in this effort, and make sure that stakeholders have an opportunity to input. And I think making sure that the Framework Convention does not overly focus on animal uses that are more common in non-industrialized parts of the world, which I think was a flaw in the first draft of the cap that we're working very hard to address in the second. Raj, anything you would like to add to that?
No, I think that captures sort of the thrust of the second draft of the cap.
That's great, thank you. So Deborah from the YouTube live stream has a few questions, starting with the One Welfare approach. Are all voices facilitated to speak and feel heard and understood?
If this question is, go ahead.
I was going to say, I can continue with her questions if you want to try to address it all as a collective thing.
I think that would be good. Yeah, I think they kind of flow together.
Yeah, so using a collaborative discussion with listening as a priority, not necessarily problem or issue solving at first, may create an environment where listening for understanding is promoted. Out of a full understanding of each position can help find common ground on which to find consensus. So I suppose, how are you aiming to make sure the convention allows all voices to be heard?
Yeah, we're a pretty small working group, and so one of the things that we're trying to be attentive to, and imagining sort of other voices, sort of containing those voices and those perspectives within ourselves. But one of the great things about our process is that after we create a draft, we keep it open for public comment, and it's really an opportunity for advocates and scholars and practitioners and people in the industry to offer feedback. What are our blind spots? And so that when we go back to the drafting process, we can be more attentive to and include those perspectives. And also working with our regional teams to sort of offer us that insight and support that's culturally and regionally and economically informed.
Yeah, thank you, Raj. That's all of the things that I was thinking of, and I think that we as a group, I will say, we're very committed to listening and learning, and we see ourselves as just sort of the facilitators of this process and trying to bring together different voices. And we really we're doing a lot of outreach to different groups working on this issue in different ways. And really, I think, Deborah, you're absolutely right to say the priority as we work on a project like this should be on listening and information gathering rather than going straight to problem solving. I think that's a great observation and very consistent with our approach.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think that's all the questions we have. I don't see anything coming in last minute. So thank you so much to both of you for your talks and for such comprehensive answers to all of these questions. It's been really wonderful listening to you talk. I'll throw the floor over to Yuriko to clue up.
Yeah, so thank you, everyone. We have nearly 100 viewers on the YouTube live stream channel and many of you on Zoom here as well. So thank you all for joining us today. Rajesh, Reddy, Daina Bray, for your time and energy on sharing this incredible, innovative and exciting project with us. And we'll be watching the progression of the Convention on Animal Protection with a keen eye.